Yes, you can click on that and then come back to this Google Meet menu and full screen.
Is it live? I think it is live. Yeah. Azar full screen? No, no, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. All those things are fine. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. Good. Okay. Fine. Fine. Cut that one. Cut that one, Azar. Ah. I think we can start. Or we can.
Sure. Are we live?
Yes.
Okay. So, hello and welcome everyone to this IE technical lecture series. This is the 28th lecture as part of this series, and today we are fortunate to have with us Ruban Phukan sir, who will be giving us a talk titled "The New Knowledge Economy in the Age of AI." So, brief about sir. He's a techpreneur with over 2 decades experience in the field of AI, machine learning, and data science. He has co-founded Bixee, India's first vertical search engine platform that was acquired by IBIBO and eventually became the technology base that started GoIBIBO. He also co-founded DataRPM, a pioneer in enterprise AI for IoT, which was acquired by Progress Software. Currently, Sir is the co-founder and CEO of GoodGist Incorporated. Their product, goodgist.com, offers knowledge discovery and learning co-pilot for professionals and enterprises. So, without any further ado, I'd like to hand the session over to Ruben sir.
Hey, thank you so much, and thanks for having me in this session. So it's a pleasure to be presenting this to every one of you. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are attending it from. Uh, so I mean, it's a very exciting time that we are currently in, with so many happening around us, right? So and the idea of this presentation is to talk about one aspect, which is something that touches like every individual in the world, so to say, right? Which is essentially knowledge, right? And knowledge is something that is inherent to us as human beings. We have always been in quest of knowledge. And with the coming of AI, so this is actually going into a whole different level of what is possible from a knowledge and learning perspective. Now, in this presentation, what I want to focus on is a particular aspect of knowledge, which is the whole coming of what the new knowledge economy is, right? So I'll touch upon what it is, what are some of the big problems that exist in this new knowledge economy, and how can AI help some of those problems, and how do we put together a solution, right? So, and this is again extract of what we do at goodgist.in. So, I mean, and thanks for the background that Abhigan already shared. Is that it is a co-pilot that we offer for enterprises, for educational institute, so which helps in the learning process, and we'll talk about some of those aspects in the part of this session. So I'd skip my background because Abhigan already talked about me. So let's get straight to quiz, right? So I'm I'm not able to see the chat window, but let me ask this question, right? And you can type in the response. But essentially, when we ask this question to people, right? So when you need to search for information, what do, right? Um, and if any one of you want to type in the answer in the chat, you can do that. But more often than not, when we ask this question, we get a pretty standard, unanimous sort of answer, is that you Google it, right? So the next thing that we typically do in our sessions is that we ask about when you need to learn, what do, right? So this is where there is usually not a unanimous answer. There are like different forms. Some people mention about libraries, other people talk about online e-learning portals like Coursera and Udemy and other places, and then people talk about Wikipedia. But there is not one common answer like it is in the first case, and that is kind of what we are trying to solve also with GoodGist, is that can we give a uniform destination for learning, right? So we like to say that when you need to learn, you get a GoodGist, right? So I promise that that's probably the end of what I'll like to talk about GoodGist. As in this presentation, I'll briefly touch upon how the part of the presentation, how we put together the solution at this end. But this presentation is not about GoodGist. It's about a bigger problem that we encounter today, right? So to talk about what is the new knowledge economy, right? So to understand what the new knowledge economy is, we need to start with what are the bigger challenges that exist when it comes to knowledge today, right? So the massive problem that the whole world today faces is the global skill crisis. So the stats as shared by World Economic Forum is that by 2020, almost 1 billion people across the world needs to be reskilled, right? And the reason is because of the rate at which technology is evolving, the rate at which new ways of doing work, right? And with AI coming in, which is kind of redefining the way that work is done, right? So which means that to adapt to those technology changes, to adapt to the changes in the work environment, so people need to learn and adapt new skills and new technologies. And the amount of people who needs to be reskilled is 1 billion. Now, to put this into better perspective, so this is almost 1/3 of the workforce that exists in the world today, right? So there is around 3.5 billion people who are in the workforce globally, right? So 1 billion is almost like 1/3 of that, right? So we have this skill problem, of course, but how big is it, right? So unless we quantify from the monetary impact perspective, it's very hard to understand how big this problem is, right? So the impact that failure to really reskill 1 billion people by 2030 would create is almost a $8.5 trillion hit into revenue globally, right? And this is the big problem, right? So this is a massive impact on the whole world economy that the inability to reskill people has, right? Now, the question that arises then is that why is it hard to reskill people, right? So why can't we follow the typical approach of either e-learning or the traditional form of learning, which is basically the academic world, right? So the problem that exists is that the traditional learning or even the e-learning in the current form, it can't really scale to cater to this need, right? The reason is that when we look at the e-learning solution that exists today, if you take like all of those, like Coursera or Udemy or you name it, almost like 70% of the users who take a course there, they don't even start the course, right? And less than 30% of the content which are even taken by the user, and when users go through it, less than 30% of the content is consumed, right? So this creates a huge disconnect. Now, why can't the classroom way of teaching scale? Of course, because classroom way is linear. It cannot be used to like upskill or train 1 billion people globally, right? It's not possible to scale from that perspective. The other big challenge when it comes to doing skill development, right, or training people for specific tasks on the job, is that you cannot follow a one size fits all approach to learning, right? It cannot be linear. It cannot be that yeah, here is a content, you give it to every individual and they will be able to just be effective at the job, right? And we can take a very simple example. Let's say AI, right? So when we talk about really training people on AI, uh, it varies based on who that individual is and what is their level of skills, right? So if you look from a technical user perspective, a mathematician would look at AI very, very differently versus an engineer looking at AI, right? Versus, let's say, a business user who is trying to figure out how to really use AI in the business context to grow business, right? The information that they need is very, very different. So if you try to create just one large course of AI, it is not going to appeal to everybody, right? And that is the whole challenge today with the one size fits all approach. The second challenge that exists is that a lot of this content is being created by companies, right, quote unquote, and it's essentially what it means is that they are being driven by external content providers, right? And when it comes to really applying it on the job, there are a lot of nuances that exist within that organization, where again, taking the example of AI, the the way that AI is being used across different type of organization. Let's say the application of AI in healthcare is very different from the application of AI in the financial industry versus the application of AI in manufacturing, right? So again, the challenge is that when an external provider creates a course on AI, right? It's not good. It's less likely to capture all those nuances that exist within those organizations, right? So the top-down approach of basically teaching doesn't help, right? The third challenge is that most of the content which are being created today, and the reason that a lot of courses are not taken, or only a small portion of the courses are completed, is because they are all long form content, right? So long form content means hours and hours of video, or hours and hours of reading material, right? So which, when we talk about people on the job, so they don't really have the time to devote so much to the to learning, right? And the stats says that most employees across companies, they have like less than 1% of the time available for learning because they are also doing their job, right? So which is why the long form approach of training doesn't work, right? And which also boils down to the fact that when you have long form approach, of training, and these are like videos that you're just consuming on a passive nature, it's non-interactive. And if it is non-interactive, it becomes non-engaging, right? Because we have always learned in a very interactive environment. So be it in schools, colleges, you learn by asking questions, you learn by interacting with the teachers, right? So non-interactive form of learning basically doesn't help, right? And most of this learning approaches, right, is basically content centric, because that is how um, traditional training has always been done, is that you focus on the content that needs to be covered rather than the learner who needs to learn about that, right? So this again creates a massive disconnect. So how do you really solve the problem of the content creation? Is that there is the whole creator economy that is evolving, that can help scale the content, right? So there are almost like 300 million creators today globally, and generating 100 billion worth of economy, right? They have created. So these creators are independent subject matter experts, independent domain experts who are creating content on, let's say, YouTube or other places, writing blogs on Medium, or writing content on Substack and other newsletters, and are sharing information through Twitter, LinkedIn, or you name it, right? So all the advantage with this approach is that the content becomes bottom up. It's being actually generated by subject matter experts on a topic rather than on the top down base approach, right? So this can help scale the content and tune it to the needs of individual organization, individual learners, right? From the need of the kind of content that is required, right? And then AI can help scale everything else. So which means that, of course, the manually created content, or even the content economy, although can help in creating personalized content to a certain extent, but it's not possible to do it on an individualized basis or an individual learner basis. And that is where AI can help scale by creating personalized learning paths for individuals, right? It can take long form content and break it down into smaller bite-sized content, which is essentially known as micro learning. And so this makes it very, very consumable, so that you are not sitting through a large amount of content. The AI can make the learning more interactive, right? It can make it more conversational, and it makes the whole approach to learning very learner centric versus the content centric, right? So so when we talk about basically the learner centric pedagogy, right? So what exactly is the learner centric versus the content centric? So I've touched upon some of those, but in this slide would like to go a little bit more into the details of how because the reason this is important, because this kind of defines the approach to learning that is more effective versus mapping the traditional form of how teaching is done, because the whole e-learning has evolved more from television centric learning, right? So because television is a one-way communication channel, right? So the early forms of e-learning that evolved was very, very similar, and that is what stayed through, and that makes it very hard to adapt to the current needs, right? And the whole television centric approach is very content centric, right? So like we mentioned, that the first and foremost is that makes it like a one size fits all, that you create a content and you broadcast to everybody, right? And you hope that it's useful for everybody, which in case of entertainment, when you're making a movie or a TV show, probably, right, which you're likely to cater to a large audience. But when it comes to learning, it's not, right? So this is where the learner-centric approach is basically focused on creating personalized learning paths for individuals, right? So it's about understanding what is the capability of that individual, right? And where are they in the learning cycle, right? So what are their intent of the learning, right? What is the context in which they are trying to learn, and then basically create learning path which is like dynamically created and adapted for the individual levels, right? So that is the first thing. The second point is, again, like I mentioned, from long form only content, so moving towards what is called as micro learning, where content is broken down into smaller chunks that are easily consumable on the go, right? And this also maps to the cognitive science, which says that human attention span is very short, right? And you can only learn in that cycle when the attention span is out there. So typically it says that your attention span anywhere from a learning perspective is like a 10 to 20 minute cycles, right? So individuals learn more on in that context. So the idea of micro learning is to take long form content and then breaking it down into those chunks, right? The third point is that the traditional approach, like I said, it's more like a broadcast mechanism, that you sit and watch video or you just read content online, which again doesn't really help, because a lot of learning happens when you interact with the content, when you ask questions, right, when you have a conversation. So to make it more effective, especially for skill development, you need that ability to interact with the content in a conversational manner, right? Which is possible on a classroom setting, but not when you are consuming online content. And that is again where AI plays a significant role. Uh, the fourth aspect is essentially uh, the how the content is being consumed, right? It's not always that you'd want to just read the content, or it's not always that you'd want to watch the content, right? So there has to be flexibility based on how someone is learning, that in certain ways you may want to just listen to the content, and other places you may want to just watch it at a given point of time, or you may want to just read it, right? So having the same content available into multiple formats, right, is again one of the critical requirement of how to make learning effective. The fifth point is the non-availability of dedicated learning time. So in the content-centric approach, you need to set aside dedicated learning time to really learn, right? Whereas the learner-centric approach is about how do you embed learning into the day-to-day life, into the work life, right? So as someone is doing work and as they need to work on a particular problem that needs them to access some form of knowledge, right? Whether this is the knowledge exists in books, the knowledge exists in some tutorial videos or company documents, right? So being able to access the knowledge, right, just when they need it and as much as that is required to get their work done and move on, is essentially what the whole philosophy of learning in the flow is, right? um, the next is how do you assess the capability of a learner? So the traditional approach is that you have a course, and then at the end of every module, there will be an assessment, there'll be a test, right? Now, while this works in a traditional learning environment, but it again doesn't work well in the skill development, because if you're like waiting till the end of a module to really determine whether the user has been able to gather that information or able to process the information the right way, it's already too late, right? Because now, if you determine that maybe the learner was only able to grasp 50% of the content, right? So which means that you'll have to restart the whole process of, again, trying to address the learning from a different perspective, versus having the ability to gather feedback on a continuous basis, whether through a conversational interface or otherwise, is again very crucial, so that time is not wasted in the feedback cycle, right? So the next is, in the content-centric approach, a lot of emphasis on the completion of the course, right? So it doesn't matter how much of that information is obtained or retained or is being applied to work. It's more focused on how much information does the learning system provide to the end user, and how to get the end user to complete a course, right? Whereas the emphasis on the learner-centric approach is not about how much content that you consume, is that how much of the content is being actually applied at the job, right? So the emphasis is on the skill application. Again, on the traditional form, the learning focus is mostly individual. So it's like everyone just learns on their own. Whereas the learner-centric approach is more about supporting learning as a community, because that is how, again, we have all learned, people learn in class groups or work groups, right? So being able to bring that aspect of community-based learning is, again, what is essential to make learning effective, right? So and then finally, the 2 points is that one, traditional learning is mostly workstation based, that you sit at one place and learn, or you go to a classroom, or you go to a training room, right, and learn, right? Versus, I mean, that may not be effective, because that's not when a learner may be ready to learn, right? So being able to provide the flexibility of learning, where they can access learning anywhere that they want, anytime that they want, right, is again of essence. And finally, the point that we touched upon is like the whole top-down versus bottom-up approach, is that there are a lot of subject matter experts across organizations and in schools and colleges, right? So people always go to that one person or that one individual who knows about a particular topic, and that is a much easier way to learn. Now, they cannot be content creators, right? Whereas what they can actually do is they can be curators, and that is how it works in the real world. Is that how do you really enable more and more content curation from subject matter expert to make it more effective as learning as a community, right? So I mean, these are basically some of the fundamental shifts that needs to happen to make learning more effective. Now, let's switch gears to talk about the large language model, because when we talk about AI in context of learning, almost always large language models, and with the advent of ChatGPT or Google Bard or the Anthropic Claude, right? It's largely in focus. So when we look at large language model, by nature they are just AI programs, right? And they're designed or they're specialized in processing human language, right? So that is why they're a language model. They are based on neural network technology. So basically, they follow the traditional neural network architecture, which has been basically customized for a specific need, right? And which is where the evolution of models like the transformer, which are specialized to learn sequences of words or sequences of terminologies that occur in human language, and then trying to learn that pattern and be able to predict the pattern is the fundamental working of a large language model. So these are large language model because they are pre-trained on massive amount of data sets. So they are either text data, and now of course there are what is known as multimodal approaches, where you train on text, images, videos, and other things together. So this enables the models to understand context, grammar, and nuances in the languages that exist. And the key aspect of large language models and the way that they evolve, and why it's called generative AI, is that once they are trained, they are able to generate contextually relevant text, and of course now images and videos as well from text content, because they have seen enough data to know the semantic of the language, so that now when you ask it to generate something new, it can actually generate something which is coherent, right? So which is contextually relevant. So it's not like gibberish, right? um, so so that is the generative capability. And then it's able to adapt to various tasks, right? So although it started as a model that basically can predict and generate the language, but now it has been fine-tuned to a lot more advanced tasks like language translation, summarization of content, answering questions, right? Or of course doing creative writing, which is the core capability of this large language model. So just to go a little bit deeper and understand how LLMs work. So the first part of LLM is the training process. So like I mentioned in the previous slide, so they're trained on really diverse set of data, which could be from books, articles, website, other text content from where the models can be trained on. And the basic idea behind the training is to have the model learn the language structure and patterns that exist, right? Things like grammar and other forms, without explicitly mentioning that this is a grammatical construct, right? So that is the whole idea of using neural nets, because with given huge amount of data, it can do pattern recognition to identify those patterns from the data itself, right? And then you basically tune the model or optimize the model to minimize the error in prediction, right? So if you have given a certain set of text and you're trying to predict the next word that comes after it, how accurately is the model able to predict that word, right? Or how accurately is the model able to pick the next word in a sentence so that it sounds meaningful, right? So that is what the optimization process is. Now, as a part of the training process, it's also important for the models to understand the context. So the way that context understanding happens is that the model breaks down the input data, the words, into smaller units called tokens, right? So this could be, I mean, in essence, you can think of tokens as words or subwords, but they are like more in terms of patterns of text that repeats more frequently across the entire collection of the training data, right? And then it learns to associate those constructs into a certain flow, right? It learns to associate when do you use a versus an, when do you use other format versus, say, when do you refer someone as him versus her, right? So those kind of nuances, and then of course going to much more detailed level in understanding languages and understanding different forms of language, different types of language, right? So that is the whole contextual understanding. Now, once the contextual understanding is strong, now you can get it to basically generate text, which is essentially predicting text on the floor. The way that um, the generative AI model works is that you give the initial text and then it starts predicting the next token or the next word, right? And then it keeps using that predicted sentence so far to predict the next word, right? So basically it goes one word at a time or one token at a time to generate the full sentence and then generate the full paragraph, right? And it's an iterative process in terms of how it keeps generating. Now, and then comes the step of fine tuning the model, which is that, yes, when you're like generating text by just predicting what that word is, sometimes it may make sense, sometimes it may not make sense, right? Or if you are trying to generate text as a response to a question, that response may be appropriate or may not be appropriate. So this is where the fine tuning of the model comes into play, where you uh, either train the model on specific domain centric content, right? So which helps it learn those nuances within a particular domain, right? So you train on healthcare data, you train on financial data, and it learns the nuances where certain things may be different when you refer in context of healthcare versus when you refer in context of finance. So the very term health has a very different meaning when you are referring to health in context of healthcare versus when you're referring to health in context of economy or finance, right? They have a very different meaning. So it can identify those nuances by fine tuning those models on domain centric data. And the other aspect is in providing continuous feedback, which is like a human feedback loop, where based on what it generates and the responses that it gives to certain question, you offer feedback whether it's correct or not, right? And then the model learns and evolves over time, which is essentially known as a reinforcement learning with human feedback in the large language model context. So now that we know how the large language model works and how it can be trained to learn nuances of languages, which is basically the foundational unit when it comes to knowledge, right? But are there certain limitations of the language model when to directly apply, excuse me, to knowledge related use cases, right? And there are. So the first is the risk of generic knowledge, because like I mentioned, most of the large language models, they are trained on everything, right? When they are trained on everything, when it comes to specific domain centric information, it becomes a challenge, right? It cannot establish the authority, right? So if there are like two conflicting theories, so it doesn't know which one to pick, right? Because the model has not been provided, in a generic format, it doesn't have the information to disambiguate that, or it doesn't know how to establish the content or intent, right? Like I said, that when I talk about what is the health, right? So unless and until that content and intent is the context and intent is provided, it will not be able to identify what is being referred to, right? The second challenge is on the training data, because again, these are models. They are as good as the data that they have been trained on. So if the data is stale, things have changed, things have evolved, the model has not been updated, then the quality of results it can generate is going to be poor, right? The second is the access to wall garden or proprietary data, because if the model is essentially train on public domain data, but you're trying to apply the model in context of work related data, which is not the model hasn't seen, so it won't be effective in those scenarios, right? And then finally, the challenge is with what is known as hallucination, where these are language model, they are just trying to predict or work by predicting the next word or terms, right? So there is a possibility that it could just entirely make up stuff, right? Which is very common. And in fact, it's one of the strengths of the model, which in the knowledge context, it's a weakness, right? It's a strength when you are looking at using the model in the creative context. You want it to generate a new story, right? So in which case you do want it to make up stuff, right? But when it comes to the knowledge domain, you don't want that to happen. You need factually correct data. So you cannot afford to have factually incorrect data, which the model can generate. Or it could generate like biased and discriminatory content, which again in the context of learning might be a big issue, right? And then finally, there is no concept of security or access control on the model itself, because the model by nature doesn't have that ability to do that, right? So that brings us to how do you really overcome these challenges, right? So the first approach to overcome this challenge, which we briefly touch upon, is in creating domain-centric model training, right? So you train the model on the domain that you want to use it, whether it's, let's say, healthcare or finance or education or manufacturing, and then you can even go down to specific nuances, saying that healthcare for say cancer research, healthcare for a regular patient care, right? So all of those related nuances, you can train the model. The more specific it's trained on, the better it becomes. But also, this is an expensive process, right? Training the model is highly expensive. So which is where the whole concept of prompt engineering comes into play. So prompt engineering is the approach of how do you really provide the question and the input content to the model so that you get it to respond in a particular way or in a particular in a specific way, right? So two of those approaches here is what is known as few shot prompting, where you give certain examples and then you tell the model to generate the response in that format, right? And the model can learn instantly on those examples and then try to replicate the response accordingly, right? So that is called the few shot prompting. The second and the more larger use is known as the retrieval augmented generation, or RAG in short. So the idea here is that you give the content to the model, right? So you basically extract the content from the wall garden content, or you extract it from specific sources, and then you give it to the model saying that here are all the sources of information. Now you basically generate a nice response or a summary to the question, right? So which is a more practical use of how large language models are being used in the industry today, right? And then you put external guardrails, is that you don't only rely on the responses that the models are giving, is that you have additional checks and balances that you put to validate the response of the model, right? To validate, have certain metrics that tracks the content quality of the model, right? And can decide when the model is hallucinating or when it's not, right? And before presenting the response. So that is the external guardrail. And then of course you can put a human validation layer where it's like critical content that needs to be presented. So you can have a subject matter expert that reviews the content before it's basically delivered, right? So these are some of the common ways of overcoming the limitation. So now let's go into the specialized topics of what are AI copilots, right? And which is a much more I mean, it's a big term in the industry today, and it's an emerging term, right? So at the very base level, a copilot is nothing but which makes the language models work for specific use cases, right? So in essence, it's that, but there are certain specific characteristics, right? So copilots are uh, like I said, that they are focused on various individual tasks, and they work alongside the user, right? They're there to offer guidance to the user to do the job, right? They provide personalized assistance along the way, right? Along the process of the job. Uh, they learn and improve the models, right, and the responses based on the interactions that are happening with the user. They facilitate collaboration between multiple users rather than a single user use case, right? So these are some of the key characteristics of what copilots are. And then essentially there are actually it's not four but five essential components of what copilots need to have. So they, at the basic level, they are artificial intelligence system. They need to have integration across existing system, because it cannot be a copilot if it's not connected to the domain, the systems that has the data and information for the domain that it's trying to help users with, right? So which also extends to the next point of having domain knowledge, or knowledge graphs that are being actually created or fed into the copilot, so that it can do things like disambiguating, identifying domain authority and things like that, right? And knowing which is correct and which is not in context of that particular domain, right? And then it needs to have the guardrails, the data security and compliance, which is required for the domain that it's working on. So for example, financial data needs a very specific kind of compliance and security requirements, right? Similarly, healthcare data, so especially in the US, you have to be HIPAA compliant and others for healthcare related data, right? So across industries, there are different compliance when it comes to data security and accessing. So those have to be built into the Copilot. And then the scalability and accessibility, so making the information available whenever it's needed to the right people who have access to it. And it should be able to scale with as much data or as many users possible, right? So these are really the key characteristics of Copilots, and Copilots is what is essentially making AI useful for various business use cases, right? So now, how do we put all of this together into, say, that how do we solve the new knowledge economy problem, right? So which is about reskilling resources and helping people learn better, right, using the same concepts that we have seen, right? So it starts with the creator. So there, the only way that we can scale knowledge is that when more people start sharing knowledge, right? Because everybody has some unique knowledge available, right? So based on their experience, their background, what they're working on, so everybody is an expert in something, right? So as more and more people share their expertise, and the key factor here is that the expertise, when shared at an individual level, comes with the nuances that are required for that context, right? So uh, um, uh, again, to just give an example, so someone who shares information about the healthcare domain in US will be able to share specific nuances and compliance related thing, which is very unique to the US market, versus someone who is sharing information about healthcare domain from India will be able to provide information which is very specific to the compliance requirement of the Indian government, right? So those nuances comes together when more and more individual creators start creating. Now, the creators can generate like content in terms of books. It could be like blogs, web pages, videos, podcast, audio, right? Or any kind of documents. Now, this content can then be fed into the LLM, and with the domain knowledge brought in specific to the domain that it's being applied to, right? So with the local nuances, creating a domain graph, right? So which talks about the individual nuances across that industry, across that business vertical, right? And then with those, you put a layer of compliance and security and access control, which is essentially all the guardrails that are required to make sure that the content that is being passed through is verified, is authenticated, is correct, right? Is compliant, uh, is only served to people who have the right access to that information, right? And then making it available in anywhere, right? So it could be on the web, on the mobile device. It could be, the key goal is to make it more conversational so that it can be accessed anywhere. Someone can ask a question, get a response, or get things in a more Q&A or FAQ style format so that it's easier to process that information very, very quickly, very, very easily. And when we put together all of those, right? So basically this creates the ability to have a skilled workforce, right? So which can learn on the go, which can learn on demand. They can learn on the job based on their individual needs, right? And this is what will help bridge the gap that the new knowledge economy is creating, right? So and that is what very quickly what we are trying to do at GoodGist is that we provide a conversational interface where based on the context, which is whether it's a business user using, is it a student using, it's a technical user using, or even for the domain, right? So which domain the user is trying to learn from and what are they trying to learn, it automatically generates the content either from the web or from specified sources, right? The content is presented in a bite-sized manner. It is conversational. It is personalized to that particular user so that as you ask more question, it will fine-tune automatically. It is collaborative, which means that multiple users can curate content, edit content, and make it available. And the content is like dynamically translated into any language. It's available in multiple formats, whether it's video format or text or audio, right? Where it can be consumed on mobile or on the web. So this is our objective. So we are trying to solve that problem of how do we help bridge that skill gap, right? So with that, hopefully you found the session useful. So thank you for that, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, sir, for this really, really informative talk. I think I can say in today's context of like what we're seeing with LLMs, this is like so relevant. And so with the questions, I think I'll start with a couple of questions from YouTube. And so the first question is regarding how can LLMs be used to create innovative AI learning material?
Yeah, so one is that based on what it's being trained on. Again, I mean, like I mentioned, that there are limitations to what LLMs can do and cannot do. So if you hope that it will create something totally new, um, it will be more fiction than fact, right? Versus if you give information, right? So if you say that let's give different pieces of information, and from that information let it deduce something and present options and results, right? So more from a research topic perspective, right? So let's say you're trying to research on a new subject, you have different pieces of information that you provide to the language model and say that synthesize this information and try to come up with certain hypothesis, right? So those are some of the ways that you can use language model. But language model inherently is not is something that can generate new things which are I mean, which would be more factual based versus fiction based, right, at this point. But yes, the more that you provide the guidance to the model, the more information that you provide upfront, it will be able to give I mean, you can use a model to brainstorm new ideas.
Got it. Okay. Second question is how so how will the job landscape change in the coming years? How does a non-tech person learn AI, and when he or she wants to work around AI?
Yeah. So I think lot of what AI is bringing to the job landscape is what, let's say, computers brought to the job landscape like a few decades back, right? So it's not that, I mean, there's a lot of talk of whether AI will take away jobs. I don't believe that AI will take away jobs, but AI will redefine jobs, right? So people have to learn on how to use AI based system to make to be more effective, just like people transition from non-computers to computers, right? So banks went from maintaining ledgers in notebooks to actually using computers to do that, and didn't take away jobs, but it redefined the job. So the same thing will happen here. Now, in terms of how do you learn about AI, like I said, that there are a lot of online content which is available. There are courses which are tailored towards learning, and at GoodGist we do also provide the ability for you to consume information in a smaller chunk if you're trying to learn it that way. So yeah, so I would say that I mean, there are non-technical centric courses on AI which is available online. I mean, Coursera or Udemy or Pluralsight and those kind of places are really good starting point for that. And then if you want to do it in a more interactive manner, you can always go to GoodGist and try it out.
Thank you, sir. I think those are the only two questions we have from YouTube. So I'll like, if anyone has any questions in the panel, maybe I'll start with myself.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes, sir. So I had a small, like maybe it's a little bit of a technical question regarding the LLM, the way we're training and then we're validating them. I was just wondering, so you mentioned something about human validation, sir, and card rating.
Mhm.
Is there any scope of having like a maybe uh, like almost an adversarial model which validates what is generated by this main model and it feeds it back, almost how
Yeah.
how they do it in image sort of generation with GANs?
Yes. I mean, it's always possible to offer feedback through models, and it's being experimented in some form. But then what you also need to determine is the quality of the model that is offering feedback, right? So if that model has issues with accuracy, right, or that model is giving incorrect feedback, so which means that you will now have an exponential problem of wrong feedback going, and which again adds wrong information here, and that cascades, right? So which is also an emerging problem in the whole LLM work when it comes to training data, because now you can use LLM to generate content, right? Now if that content is being published on the web, and then again the LLMs learn from that content, right? So there is that cascading effect. So it relies on the fact that the LLMs are generating correct content at the get-go, right? Similarly, any model that is providing feedback needs to make sure that those are absolutely correct, because otherwise the negative effect is going to creep in.
Thank you, sir. I think other sir has
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah, if you allow me a question, sir, this is related to that part of your talk, like where you discussed about the two methodologies, the content centric and the learner centric way of learning, and
Mhm.
uh, and of course, at a personal level, like I completely relate to all of those points that you mentioned, the differences, the impact it creates. But sir, I wanted to know if there's any formal study which actually helps us to conclude that like this form of study is, I mean, learning is much better than the other form, and if there's any objective measure by which we can say like this is this much better than the other. So
Yes, so there are various forms of studies that talk about different aspects. So there are studies on how the cognitive science applies to the learning approach, where when you break down large form of content into smaller chunks, how that impacts the learning. So there is a whole set of studies around that. Uh, there are studies in terms of how learners learn better when they interact with one another versus when they just learn on their own, right? There are separate sets of studies that talk about or touch upon how conversational or Q&A form helps in reinforcing or better retention of information, right? So which is also ties back into the flashcard or the format, right? So which we basically people use for revision, right? So there are all those different forms of studies. So there is no one study that proves all of those points together. There are like various different kinds of studies which are available, and you can definitely look up on Google and you'll find all those studies there.
oh, okay, thank you, sir.
Hello. So it's
Yeah.
very interesting and very informative talk. Uh, and I have one question when you generate the content, for example, one user is generating the content. So at that time, are you using any kind of filter? Because LLM can generate anything, like any bad things or maybe hallucinations, all those things. So how you are handling all those in GoodGist?
Yeah. So we, like I mentioned, that we have all the guardrails in place. So first and foremost, we don't really generate the answer from the LLM. So we maintain our own index of content. We have our own knowledge graph. So we basically search through that, and we are only using LLMs to summarize that information, right? So even after it summarizes, so we have that check saying that is the LLM adding new information that is not present in the original content that we provided to the LLM to summarize, right? So we do that calculation. Is that helps us determine if the LLM is hallucinating, right? So if it is hallucinating, then we basically regenerate the information. So we have all those checks and balances. We have guardrails in place. We have the knowledge graph, which validates whether it's giving information which is not aligned to what the user is asking for.
Okay, okay. And thank you. And another thing for nowadays, for example, if we want to build some kind of apps on top of these LLMs, so what suggestion you will give for this new person? Because there are multiple open source LLMs are there. There are multiple paid LLMs are there. So, what is your suggestion so for a new person to work around that?
Yeah. So again, there is no one standard. I mean, LLM where it works well for everything. So a lot depends on what is the end problem that you're trying to solve, right? So I mean, my suggestion is that always start with the problem and then work backwards and try to identify what is the right model to use to solve that problem versus starting with the LLM first, right? Because if you find that that LLM is not really the best fit for the problem that you're trying to solve, it defeats the purpose, right? The second is again the use case and who you are trying to cater to and what are their requirements, right? Because a lot of enterprises, they are not comfortable with sending their data out to, let's say, OpenAI, right? So if you're trying to build something to cater to those kind of customers, so then that approach won't work. So you have to identify something which is which you can host or the customer can host themselves and apply, right? So those are all those nuances. Then again, also comes into to look into the fact that what kind of content do you need for that LLM? Do you need to really fine tune the model, or can you use the traditional retrieval or augmentation method, the RAG method, to actually generate your responses? And if so, then also the context size will matters, right? Because not all models, or especially the ones which are like open source, they don't have very large context size support yet, right? It will be, but yet. So in those cases, again, you are restricted to what kind of models that you can use, right? So I think it's always good to start with the problem and then define and then identify what kind of a model works best for that approach.
Okay, thank you, sir. I think we done. Maybe we can wrap up.
Yes, sure, sir. So once again, thank you one and all for being part of this talk today, and especially thank you so much, Ruban Phukan sir, for giving us this talk. And surely we look forward to having you again sometime in the future.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And hopefully it was useful for everyone. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. With that, I think we can end the live stream.
Okay. We can end that, Ajay.